Okay, so what we're going to cover today is just another way of dealing with asynchronous code. So we looked at callback functions and promises, and then we're going to look at kind of like a newer feature in JavaScript called async await. This kind of makes our code look more synchronous, but without the like .thens, and so it kind of feels a little bit more synchronous looking, and it just kind of makes writing asynchronous code a little bit easier. And it works very well with just the promises already. So it's not like either or; they kind of work together with them. So that's what we're going to look at today. If you want to download this repo, I just took the code that I did from the Sequelize ORM video lecture and just pushed it up to GitHub. So if you want to clone it from that point, you can. And we're going to modify it to use this async await. Okay, so I'm going to copy this, or open up the link, and then clone this. Okay, so I'll say git clone, and I'll call this async await. Oh, I think I already did it. Okay, so I'll cd into that directory. So I'm really just kind of downloading the repo, cd into it, and then open it up with my editor. And this repo doesn't have the npm modules, so we have to run npm install. So you can do the npm I, or you can say npm install. I think I put it under the ITB 405 Spring 2019. So just click on the link on week 12. And then while you're also doing that, if you want, I'm going to first start off just demonstrating async await without using this repo. So there's a really cool program called Run.js, and kind of makes it's nice for just running. Weird, it's not popping up. Oh, there it goes. So if you click on the link, you can actually download it. But it just makes for like writing little snippets of JavaScript and trying it really nice and easy. You could do this, write in a file and run it via Node, but this is kind of handy. So I could say something like console.log 3, and then it just automatically runs and you see it in the sidebar. So makes it really handy. So if you want to download that, you can. Alternatively, you can just create a file, a JavaScript file, do the same code, and then run node and then like the file name, kind of like node app.js or whatever the file is. It's up to you. Okay, so let's start off just reviewing kind of what callback functions are. So I think the one we first started off with was like set timeout, right? So you can pass in a function to set timeout, and after like 3 seconds you could run this function. So this is a callback function, and set timeout is asynchronous because oh yes, question?
I'm sorry, can we either turn off the lights or can you make it like
oh
more contrast?
yeah, let me see.
The lights down. Keep on the back.
Is that good? Cool. Oh, I see. Actually, maybe I can change the theme on this because this is like a dark theme the first time I'm using it. Let me see if there's like a white theme. Oh, there we go. Nice. Okay, so set timeout is asynchronous. So, we run our code, and when this executes, it's going to delay this function for at some future point in time, which is 3 seconds, and then execute it. So this is kind of like one way for dealing with asynchronous code. Another approach is, say you had some function that talked to a database. So maybe you wanted to, uh, get a list of artists. Oh, that's weird. Like the parentheses are white. Okay, wait, hold on. Let's try another theme. Oh, yeah, thanks. Okay, so for example, if we had this function called getArtist, maybe this would do kind of like some database call, which is asynchronous. And then at some point in time, maybe we want to give the caller an option to do something about it. So then we could invoke it like this. We could say getArtist and then pass in a function. And this would get called with the eventual artist. So kind of like in our function, we could say, let artist is equal to the result of some database query, and then this would receive the callback function as a parameter. And then at the end of this, we could say callback function and execute it with the artist. So this is kind of like callback function. So one way of dealing with asynchronous code, which would, in this case would be like the database call. So you'll see this kind of a lot in built-in Node libraries. And then the next one we learned was promises. So if we wanted to kind of convert this over to a promise style, we could say function get artist, and that would kind of maybe do some database thing, but we would say get artist, execute it, and then if it returns a promise, we can call that .then. So it's very similar, but like we learned that the .then takes in two functions. So the first one is like when it's successful, and then the second function is when there's an error. So we would have something like this. So error, and then over here it would be artist. So that's kind of like the other style. So what we can actually do in kind of newer versions of JavaScript is leverage this thing called async await. And the way this works is okay, let's imagine this says, I'll put a comment here that says returns promise. So it does some database query and returns a promise, which is making this work. Comment this out. So with async await, we can tag a function as being asynchronous. So we can say this is an async function. And then we can say await get artist. And so what this looks like is we essentially remove the .then, and then the success callback that would have gotten executed, that becomes a variable kind of on the left-hand side of this await. So we can say let artist is equal to await get artist. So we've essentially like removed the .then call, and it kind of put this await keyword in front of the thing that returns a promise, and this is kind of like the equivalent using this newer feature. So it it makes the code a little bit more you could say like readable. or more synchronous looking, I guess you could say. Okay, so that's not really all there is to it, but so we'll kind of dive into some more edge cases. But what I wanted to do is let's go back to our API and give you a chance to try it on one of our endpoints. So I'm going to serve this up. So I'll say nodemon app.js. And let's pick one of these endpoints. Okay, so let's do the API/playlist endpoint. So if I browse to, I think this was on 8000. So if I go to localhost 8000/API/playlist, this should return a list of playlists. Now taking kind of like what we see here, convert, spend like 5 minutes and let's see, where is it? Here it is. Convert this endpoint to use async await. And then we'll kind of go over the solution together. I'll close the sidebar and keep them side by side so you can kind of see both. All right, so let's go ahead and do this one together. So here we can just go to our route handler function, tag it with this async keyword, and then we can go down to where we invoke this asynchronous call that calls .then, so the promise, and we can say, I'll just copy this and comment this one out. And I'll say let playlist is equal to playlist.findAll. And I can delete the .then. and I'll put this await keyword here. So this thing is asynchronous. And then call response.json right afterwards, so no more .then, and this should be it. So let's make sure it works. And you can see it still works. So one easy thing that like sometimes you might get, I forget, is like if you forget the async keyword and you try this, so if I delete it and then refresh the page, Node will kind of give you like this type of error. So it's saying like, hey, you can't call await inside a function that isn't tagged with that async keyword. So just FYI, sometimes I forget. So yes.
So what happens if, like usually when you have a normal promise structure, I guess you have like the second function for
The error?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the next part. Yeah. Yeah, so the next part of this was like, okay, so we handled like the success case, which is, this first callback. So how do you deal with errors? And so with errors, the way this works is we can use something called a try-catch block, and you may have heard of this in like other programming languages. But the way this works is, let me comment all this out for now. So you have these like this new structure called try and then catch. And so inside the try section of this, you can say write a piece of code, and if an error gets what's called thrown, then the catch, it'll immediately go to like the catch block, and you can catch the error. So for example, so this works with like really anything. So there's a lot of different types of errors built into the browser, and I think I put a link to it on the under week 12. If you click on this error, there's a few different like types of errors that can get thrown. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see like eval error or range error or reference error. And one common thing that have you ever seen like let's see, say I try and call like a function A that isn't defined, or well, yeah, let's do that. So if this executes, then I can console log error, and it's essentially catching the error that was thrown here, and it's reference error because this function A isn't defined. And so this error is like it's like a class in the browser, and it has a few different properties. And one of them is, if you scroll down a little bit, there's let's see, where is it on here? Oh, here it is. So an error object. So kind of this error. Well, okay. So there's these different types of errors, and they all inherit from like this base error class. So this like generic error, and because there's different types of errors, and they all have this property called message. So I could say console log error.message, and I can see just the message, so which is A is not defined. I can also get access to the type, so I could say console.log error.constructor.name, and this is like getting a reference to like the class of this type of error. So in this case, it was the reference error class, which you can actually see kind of on the doc. So this reference error right here. And sometimes I think they have like the line number and stuff where it's thrown. So some other information. But basically you have this try catch block. You put some code in here, and if an error gets thrown, this catch block immediately gets executed. So it kind of like goes directly to there. So we can take this try catch and use this with our async await. So in this case, when we had kind of this get error right down here, we could change this up to use a try catch. So we could say try, move this into here, and we'll say catch error. And these two are essentially equivalent, but using async await. Okay, so knowing this, I think if we look at our code, there was one of these endpoints that actually used the catch function. Yes. Okay, it was the validation one. So if we tried to create an artist in our API, if we said artist.create, we passed in like the parameters to create the artist with. If the creation was successful, we got past the artist and we could send that down as JSON. If it wasn't successful, meaning it like failed the validation that was on the artist class, then the second function of the promise would get executed. So if we looked at, shoot. So if we look at our artist class, there are all these fields, and we could, well, really just the name field that we applied validation to. So validate, and there are a handful of different validation rules, but this was the rejection case for the promise. So I think it would be a good point is to spend 5 minutes and try and attempt to convert this to async await, and then we'll kind of do it together. Now, if you want to test this out yourself, remember we, at least in the video, I covered the Postman app. So you can kind of try to make sure this works, you can test it out in Postman. Here, let me actually get the Postman set up. So if you forgot how to use this, so API/artists. The headers, I think if you do content type application JSON and hit send, yes, okay. And you can see like the validation errors.
Can you do the playlist real quick? Like where the we did before?
Where the what is?
The playlist, like down there where we did the wait first thing.
This one?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, so I put the URL here, so the endpoint. Under headers, put in content type application JSON. And then I just did like, oh, I had to save, but like under body, put in like raw, and then I put in like a little JSON with an empty name property. I think that should be it. I think also if you like click on this application JSON, this fills in the headers, so that's where that came from. All right, so let's go ahead and do this one. All right, so I'm going to copy out this code and just comment this out. I'm going to repaste it. Okay, so the first thing is I will tag this as async. And then I will say await artist create, and I'll say let artist is equal to await artist. And then, all right, so let me break this up. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of wrap this up in a try catch block. So I'll copy this and paste that there. I'll say catch error. Okay, so if this is successful, we will say create the artist, await that, and then send the JSON down. Otherwise, I will copy this chunk. And looks like I called it validation, so I'm just going to kind of rename this to validation. And then delete this. And that should be the equivalent. So let's try this out. I'll send it. Okay, looks like I get the same error response. Let me fill in something. I'll just fill in some garbage. Send. Oh, let's see, it has to be between 2 and 10. Cool. And then it responds back with a 200 and the new artist that was created. Any questions? By the way, also like async await is a feature that also works, I think, in most browsers today. So like even when you're doing client-side JavaScript, async await, let's see, browser support. Yeah, it's like generally pretty widely supported, so. Yes. What was that? Oh, the code? Yeah, sure. Like this specific endpoint? Okay, so the last piece is, so what happens when we have functions that do multiple async things, then how do we deal with that? So for example, I'm just going to actually kind of delete all this. And let's say I have a function called do async 1. So maybe the, okay, so let's say using kind of just regular promises, we'll say do async thing 1 returns a promise. Then we have do async 2 dot then. So how do we model kind of this using this async await? So what we can do here is, so let's see, this is A, we'll call this B. So we have access to A and B, kind of A and B here. So the way we can do this with async await is we can say let A is equal to await do async 1, and then we can use multiple await keywords inside a function. So we could say let B is equal to await do async 2. and then you have access to A and B here. So you can see, like, as you have routes, like with one route where it's like, oh, it's just one like promise or whatever, it's it's not that bad. But like when you have multiple things going on, it kind of makes things maybe a little bit cleaner to look at. And we actually had a route that did multiple async things, and it was the delete call. Okay, so if we look at this delete call, remember how with, let me actually kind of go back to the database schema. Okay, so this endpoint, just as a refresher, was deleting a specific playlist. And we can see that there was this join table that contained the playlist ID and then the track ID. And so in order to delete a playlist first, we need to delete all the tracks from this playlist underscore track table. And then once that's complete, then go ahead and delete the record, the playlist record from this playlist table. And that's so that, like, if we were to delete directly just that playlist ID 6 or whatever, then you have a table that's referencing playlist ID 6, but then that doesn't exist here. So that's like that, what they call orphaned record. So we need to kind of clean this up first and then go ahead and delete that. Now, sometimes you can kind of, at the database level, you can enforce this too. So like when you delete things, you can do what's called like a cascade delete. So you delete one thing and it'll kind of delete all the like child records and stuff. That's like another topic. So in this specific call, we just did, 2 async things. And so we could see, like, we first found the playlist. And then once we found the playlist to see if it existed, then we set all the tracks to an empty array, which is like deleting it. And then we also destroyed that playlist record. So there's like multiple async things going on here. So knowing that you can take, this async await syntax and apply it to multiple, you can apply it to, you can use it multiple times in a function. Let's do that with this. So take a couple minutes and try and refactor this to use async await, and then we'll kind of, do it together. Okay, so let me get Postman set up. So I'll make a request to a delete request. So I'll change this to delete HTTP localhost API / playlist / 5. Okay, so we can see it actually working. So we see a 204 when I hit send, so that means it was successful. But if I press send again, I've already deleted it. So now we should see 404 not found. Okay, so I'm going to copy this piece, comment it out, and then paste it. Okay, so let's kind of get the structure in place. So actually the first thing we should do is add the async keyword to the function. And then we will create the try catch block. There's also like a finally, so when I hit tab, it kind of added this thing. So if you want to do something after either of these, you can throw it in this finally. In this case, I'm not really using it, so I'm just going to delete it. So I'll say catch the error. Okay, so let's move these around a bit. So I'll say, so let's take care of this piece. So I'll say let playlist is equal to await playlist find by PK. And then here I can say if there's a playlist, then I can say set tracks. So I'll copy this and I'll say, since this is asynchronous, I'll say playlist.set tracks to an empty array. And then I can also say playlist or await playlist.destroy. And if there is no playlist, so there's two ways we can handle this. Kind of down here in this example, I said return promise reject, so that from this whole then block, if it returns a rejection, then it immediately goes down to here. So in order to kind of like mimic this, I can use like the throw keyword. So in a try catch block, I can like throw my own errors, and I can say throw new error. And at this point, when it throws this error, it'll immediately go down here. And then I can say response.status404 and just send that response. So that's kind of like one way to handle it. The other approach is maybe just not throwing the error at all and just doing the sending of the forward response right here. So kind of up to you. Yeah, I wouldn't say there's like a right answer here, just maybe personal preference. Okay, so I'll kind of leave it like this for now. Okay, so the last piece is sending the 204 status. So just as a refresher, 200 is like in general means success as a HTTP status code. 204, it's if you're not like sending anything as a response body, but it's still successful, then like 204 is generally the status code. I think I covered this in like the video, but since it was just a video, let's see. Yeah, so you can kind of like Google all these response codes, but if you say like 204, no content, so it still means successful, but there is no content to send for this request. Yeah, there's a lot of different codes here, so you'll see these. If you're like creating an API, generally you want to kind of like follow these because they're just good recommendations. Some places maybe go like just leave it as like 200 and 400 and just kind of go with like a couple. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, okay, so I'll copy the 204 piece and then paste this right here. So in this case, like the find the playlist, wait for it, then delete all the tracks, then destroy that playlist and delete it from the playlist table. And if it's not found, we'll send a 404. Now you could also kind of just throw in like a general error response. So if like for whatever reason there's an error with some of these and it's not not finding a playlist, then you could just kind of throw in like a catch-all, throw a 500, meaning maybe something went wrong on the server. That's generally like what 500 means, and send that down. So it's a empty 500 response. You could also like throw in the error too, but maybe you don't want to like expose all the necessary details. Maybe just say like 500. The site has been notified or something. Okay, so let me comment this out. Let's see. Did I duplicate it twice? Oh, yeah. Well, I'll delete this then. So if we kind of compare the two, I mean, it does look like less code in general. It's a little less noisy, and so that's why a lot of people are just have gotten really excited about like this little syntax, just because it's kind of makes code cleaner and just easier to like reason about. Okay, so let's test this out to make sure it works. So if we do send, I still see the 404. I'll try a different playlist like 6, 204, so it's successful. 404, so it looks generally good. So that's pretty much all there is to async await. You can see that just this syntax alone, it's not like in place of promises. It works together with promises because this await keyword, it's awaiting on a promise. So the thing to the right of the await keyword is a promise. So it kind of goes hand in hand with them. It's not like either or, but you could either write your code using like the .then and consuming promises directly, or you can sort of indirectly consume promises via this async await syntax. So any questions on this? I think so this feature is actually originated in like .NET, which is like Windows, right? So C#, another language, like kind of Microsoft technology. This is where it originally came from, which is interesting. I didn't know that. I just kind of recently discovered that. Okay, so so whenever you do your code, I mean, it's up to you whether you want to use the promises or the async await. I mean, generally when you're looking online, you're going to see one of those three patterns, like the callbacks, consuming that directly. You'll typically see that like when you're looking at Node library. So if I were to look at like Node, let's see, what is it? Read file. So if I'm like reading files in Node and looking at the raw function to do this, you can see that they just by default use like the callback approach. A lot of libraries end up using the promise approach, kind of like what we saw in Sequelize. And then I think in a lot of like application code, you'll end up seeing async await just because a lot of developers find it as like a nice clean syntax. Okay, so that's pretty much it for async await. I put some links and stuff you want to read a little bit more.